There is a question that has been sitting unanswered at the foundation of Moroccan identity for a long time. It is common knowledge that this land was lived in long before anyone wrote about it by the many and varied Amazigh communities whose descendants, much reduced after centuries of conquest and assimilation, still live across the Maghreb today. The physical traces are everywhere. Megaliths, cist graves, rock shelter paintings, stone tools, scattered pottery, on hilltops and in valleys across the country. But the academic record on who these people actually were is remarkably thin. The sites were noted, sometimes mapped, but rarely excavated in any depth, and almost never dated. Before the Phoenicians, sailors from the eastern Mediterranean who set up trading posts along the North African coast from around the 9th century BCE, scholarship treated this region as essentially empty. The Latin phrase terra nullius, no one's land, was used in all seriousness. Everything after the Phoenicians, through Carthage, Rome, and eventually the Arab conquest that brought Islam, was recorded by literate outsiders. The find that has begun to break this picture is a small hilltop in the Oued Laou Valley, about 9 kilometers inland from the Mediterranean coast. Locally known as Kach Kouch, the site was identified in 1988 and excavated 4 years later by Youssef Bokbot and Jorge Onrubia Pintado, who concluded from the Phoenician pottery in its deposits that it was a small Iron Age settlement of the 9th to 6th centuries BCE. The report fit what scholars expected at the time, but what the brief 1992 excavation missed was that the village actually predated the Phoenicians by more than 1,000 years. It would turn out to be the first well-documented Bronze Age settlement in the Maghreb and the earliest evidence of a settled community in North Africa outside of Egypt. This is the first detailed window onto how the indigenous people of Morocco actually lived 3,000 years ago. This video is built around 2 papers published in 2025 by Hamza Benatia and his collaborators, the team that returned to Kach Kouch with modern excavation methods and radiocarbon dating, and pieced together a chronology the 1992 dig could not have seen. The first, in antiquity, lays out the excavations. The second, in the African Archaeological Review, maps the ritual landscape across the wider peninsula. Between them, they account for only a fraction of what still lies beneath, but they are enough to begin reconstructing daily life in a Morocco that existed before Islam, before Rome, before any of it had been written down. But before we travel back thousands of years, a quick note from our sponsor. A lot of my work for Fenster happens online. Most projects involve long hours of research, digging through sources, and following deep internet rabbit holes. And somewhere in that process, you start to realise how much of it is tracked and how much privacy you're giving up. The sites you visit themselves can get a pretty clear sense of what you're doing and when. CyberGhost VPN encrypts your traffic, routes it through servers across more than 100 countries, and thanks to their strict no-logs policy, they don't store records of what you do online. Nobody sees what you're accessing, not the network, not your provider, not anyone. And that matters to me whether I'm at home or connected to some public Wi-Fi while travelling. It also means you're not geographically locked out of content. Platforms like Netflix or Amazon Prime have entirely different libraries depending on where you are. With CyberGhost VPN, you can actually choose where you appear to be and access what's there. One subscription covers up to 7 devices, so it's not just for you. Your whole household can run on it. Over 38 million people use it. Trustpilot has it rated excellent by more than 20,000 reviews. And right now, there's an 83% discount plus 4 months free through the link in the description, or by scanning the QR code on screen with a 45-day money-back guarantee if you decide it's not for you. Most of what is now known about the people who inhabited this region comes from recent excavation campaigns. From 2021, an Italian-Spanish-Moroccan project led by the archaeologist Hamza Benatia, who returned to the hilltop at Kach Kouch, and the picture they have assembled is the first ever detailed account of who these people were. It remains a frontier. The settlement is barely a tenth excavated, no skeleton from the site has yet been described, and much of what follows is read from seeds, post holes, animal bone, and broken pottery. There were almost certainly many such communities. Kach Kouch is one hilltop that happened to survive looting, ploughing, and the long indifference of earlier excavators, and its own report concludes it is unlikely to have stood alone. The wider valley and the coast behind it must once have held others, most of them now gone or still buried. What can be said with confidence is that around 3,000 years ago, on a limestone outcrop, a community of fewer than 100 people lived by farming and herding, probably in families or clans, within a kinship-based social system. But these were people with their own language, their own way of working the land, their own symbols, and in all probability a deep and long-running body of belief and mythology about the living and the dead, a subject we will come back to later in the video. Of the people themselves, they were probably dark-haired and brown-eyed, with complexions ranging from olive to medium brown. Behind them lay the older Tafarolt population, hunter-gatherers from the Grotte des Pigeons in eastern Morocco, whose remains represent the so-called Mekta Afalu type, tall, powerfully built, with large, broad, robust skulls. They wore clothing against the wet Mediterranean winters, though none of it survives. What can be said for certain comes down to two small objects, a pair of ostrich eggshell beads from the main phase of the settlement, the only personal ornaments yet recovered. Tattoos are possible, but unproven. Geometric tattooing survived among Amazigh people into living memory, and the older comparison is Egyptian. Libyan groups, part of the broad and diverse Amazigh world, appear in Egyptian reliefs and tomb paintings with decorated robes, patterned arms, legs and necks, and feathers worn on the head. Some of these images date to the early 12th century BC, close to the later life of Kach Kouch. Related communities across North Africa likely travelled, exchanged, and shared traditions. Put together, the evidence points to meals of grain, beans, peas, meat, marrow, milk, and gathered shellfish, the food of a settled farming community that knew its land well. The largest thing they left behind is their pottery, so much of it that the hill's local name is said to come from the clatter of broken sherds underfoot. The excavations recovered some 8,000 handmade fragments, storage jars, cooking pots and serving bowls in open and closed shapes. The pots of the main phase carry a distinctive decoration, made with combs and twisted cord pressed into the wet clay, and with deep rounded punctures driven in from the outside before firing. The style was made locally, and yet a single sherd bearing the same rounded punctures has been found on the banks of the Moulouya River, which suggests a way of marking pottery shared across a wide stretch of northern Morocco. Stone was worked here throughout the life of the village, 337 pieces of it, most a fine, dark grey flint knapped on the spot, into scrapers, bearings and sickle blades for everyday tasks. And from a deposit of the main phase came a small, irregular fragment of tin bronze, radiocarbon dated to between 1110 and 920 BC. It is the earliest radiocarbon dated bronze object known anywhere in North Africa west of Egypt. Its shape may be scrap, the waste trimmed from a casting made in a two-part mould, and its chemistry is unusual for the region. It belongs with a wider pattern at Kach Kouch, objects and materials that seem to have arrived from elsewhere through trade, exchange, or movement between communities, a network that reached as far as Iberia, where African ivory and ostrich eggshell have been found in Copper Age tombs. These people were certainly not isolated, and the clearest sign of it lies across the water. At its narrowest, the Strait of Gibraltar is about 14 kilometres, close enough that each shore is visible from the other on a clear day, and across that gap the southern Iberian Peninsula was running a Bronze Age of its own. The two coasts had been in contact for thousands of years. The very farming that fed Kach Kouch had crossed the strait from Iberia in the 6th millennium BC. Farming, herding, pottery and stone tools kept this community alive, but they did not live by survival alone. They were likely deeply spiritual and seemed to have understood the world through another order of meaning, in which the spiritual world held an important central place. Across the wider Tangier Peninsula, some of the most visible things these communities left behind are graves, standing stones and ritual monuments. Their exact purpose cannot always be proven, but it is possible that some graves and monuments worked as sacred places built for the dead, a local version of a wider ancient idea also seen in Egypt, where tombs could become houses of the divine and places of worship. They belong to memory, death and belief. So the next question is, what did they actually believe? What follows is, for the most part, careful speculation. The excavations at Kach Kouch tell us how these people lived. They do not tell us what they believed. Almost nothing here is read directly from the two publications. It is an attempt to set their physical remains beside what we know of human beings everywhere, and to ask what kind of inner world might have stood behind the graves and the stones they left in this landscape. From Göbekli Tepe, the great ringed pillars raised in Anatolia 11,000 years ago, to the painted caves of the Ice Age, to the standing stones and passage tombs of Atlantic Europe, the same thing keeps surfacing. Long before people built durable houses for themselves, they built durable things for something larger, a shrine, a tomb, or a sacred place. These places were often filled with paintings, drawings, and carved signs, images that seemed to have carried stories rather than decoration alone. Not stories for entertainment, but stories with spiritual weight that communicates divine truths about the living world and the dead. Northwest Morocco was no exception. This is a standing stone raised on the Tangier Peninsula. It is a single pointed monolith, more than 2.5 meters long, set deliberately upright at a corridor that runs between the Tahadart Plain and the mountain of Jebel Musa. A second, smaller stone stands at the foot of a hill overlooking the old inland road toward Tetuan. Both were recorded only recently by Benatia's survey. A much larger monument has long been known further inland, Mazura or Masura, southeast of Asila. It is a great ring of standing stones around a central mound, with more than 160 monoliths still recorded and the tallest rising above 5 meters. Unlike the smaller standing stones identified in recent surveys, Mazura has been described since the 19th century, excavated poorly in the 20th, and still remains only partly understood. Its scale alone makes the point. To describe what such remains might have meant, the most useful word is animism. It is a modern term, coined by anthropologists in the 19th century. It names a way of seeing the world that recurs across early human societies. In such a world, the river, the mountain, the animal, the dead, and the unseen forces of weather are not inert backdrop, but are participants with whom one has relationships and obligations. The recurring pattern is to treat the dead as entities who have changed their state rather than ended. Persons still bound into the world of the living. They are cared for. The body is handled with attention, marked with pigment, given objects, laid in a chosen place. Sometimes it is returned to, and sometimes its bones become relics of the ancestors. The graves of the Tangier Peninsula fit that pattern closely, For thousands of years, the people of this coast buried their dead in stone cists, 4 upright slabs sunk into the ground and closed with a 5th. With it were placed objects, pottery, and in some graves, a halberd, the leaf-shaped blades known as palmela points. One such cist, at Darua Zaydan on the silted Tahadat Bay, has been radiocarbon dated to between 2119 and 1890 BC, the first absolute date for any cist burial in northwest Africa, and proof that this way of burying the dead was already old here 4,000 years ago. Before the cists, and alongside them, the dead were also laid in caves, several of them clustered around Jebel Musa. The Numidians and Mauritanians, the Amazigh peoples the Romans came to know, kept an elaborate cult of the dead, with decorated tombs and offerings, and they held certain rocks, caves, springs and mountains to be sacred. Their descendants did the same. Across the Maghreb, the later veneration of local saints, the Marabouts whose tombs became places of pilgrimage and blessing, is widely understood as old ancestor reverence carried into an Islamic frame. This corner of Morocco, and the deep history beneath it, has been neglected for a very long time. Its tombs have been looted for centuries, the cists prized open and emptied, whole cemeteries dug away. Sites lie unstudied because the older story, the one that began the history of this land with the arrival of later civilizations, left little room for what came before. This is Morocco's deepest historical layer, the inheritance of the people who were here first and never left, and it deserves to stand at the very centre of how this land remembers itself. Get your 83% discount and 4 months for free. Use the link in the description and keep what you do online private. Thanks to CyberGhost VPN for sponsoring this video.